Hello and happy Friday. It is March 31st, 2023. I'm Jer Stays, and, well, Devin was on the show earlier this week, which meant that Friday had a little bit of a hole in it, and I wanted to fill it with the same kind of usual spirit that Devin brings, which is fun and a little bit of Detroitiness. And with this, we're going to dive into Detroit history. See, 1935 was an amazing year for Detroit sports, and there are a couple of people who have a podcast based just on that, and they are doing an event at the Detroit Historical Museum coming up soon. So let's jump to that conversation. If it sounds maybe just a little bit of a different echo in the room or just a little bit of a different sound of the microphone, that's because I am recording this show at the fine studios here of the Detroit City of Champions podcast. I feel like I'm on a road game. Yeah. And so joining me to talk about this amazing concept, the Detroit City of Champions, we're going to get into it, is James Flanagan. He is co-host of that podcast, and Charles Avison. He's also the co-host, also an author.
Yeah, glad to be here, Jim.
Trilogy of
glad
books.
to have you here, man.
Yeah, so this is the Podcast Your Voice Studios. We're here right on the border of Berkeley and Southfield, just north of 12 on Greenfield. Yeah, I got like 3 different podcasts, right? So I'm like a podcast junkie.
You can't just have one, right?
Man Cave Happy Hour, Little Animal Talk, and then, of course, just the one that we're super passionate about, Detroit City of Champions. And
it's a deep dive into the greatest season in the history of American sport. And just to say how big the season was, we just finished up our 91st episode with you, Jer. 91 episodes talking about 1 year in Detroit sports
haven't even
history.
scratched the surface yet.
And we're going strong on it.
Well, there's so many levels to it. So for the uninitiated,
Yes.
Quick thumbnail, the Detroit City of Champions year, what is it?
Did you know that in 1935, the Tigers, Lions, and Red Wings all won their first championships in the same season?
It's a stunning fact.
It's a stunning fact. I'll rephrase it another way. What year did the Tigers win their first World Series? What year did the Lions win their first NFL championship? What year did the Red Wings win their first Stanley Cup? It was the same season, 1935. It carried a little bit into 36 with the Red Wings, but it was all within a 7-month stretch of time. That has never been repeated by any other city since that time to win 3 championships in the same season, let alone their first championships in that same season.
And that's just the big 3.
And that's just the beginning.
And then it goes, there are 30 other champions all within
so,
that
wasn't
same
Joe
year.
Louis part of this?
Yes. That's the other thing, too, is that when I first came across this, I was a senior at Western in 2005, tried to write a 2-page paper for a history class, and could not find enough information to fill a 2-page paper. And that's where I'm like, this is something that needs some more investigation. So I ended up making it my thesis to graduate from Western. What I found when I went to the original newspapers was that it wasn't just the 3 teams. You had the rise of Joe Louis, the greatest heavyweight of all time, one of the most influential athletes in the history of American sport, rose from an unknown. Nobody knew who Joe Louis was before 1935. Very few. Some of the big, more diehard fight fans did, but very few people had ever heard of Joe Louis. 1935, at the same time as the Tigers, Lions, and Red Wings were all engaged with winning their first championships, Joe Louis rose from obscurity to become the greatest star in the world at that exact same moment.
It's astounding. And the funny thing is, he didn't win the championship in 35. He was supposed to. He was fighting Max Baer, but Max Baer lost the belt in the fight before.
If anybody's ever seen the movie Cinderella Man, that's the story of James Braddock beating Max Baer and winning the heavyweight championship. The hidden damage caused by that fight was Joe Louis was scheduled to face Max Baer in the very next fight, and now he was going to still face Max Baer, but Braddock but now for the belt. And so Louis lost his chance to take the heavyweight championship in 1935 because he lost it to Braddock the week before, the month before.
And when you talk about the city of Detroit and the Metro Detroit region, it was a very different place in 1935.
Oh, yeah.
Like looking things up, there were 1 million more people within the city limits in 1935 than there are today. Right now, the official count's been like 632,000. It was basically 1.6 million in 1935 at the time. And I think this is one of the reasons why this story resonated with so many people at the time. And I believe is kind of the beginning of the root of this. And one of the reasons why, when I had the opportunity to talk to you both about Detroit City of Champions, is that at the time we were in the throes of the Depression.
It's in the middle of the Great Depression, yes.
Yeah, we're talking about a 40%
in Detroit
unemployment rate.
Detroit is the hardest hit city in the country, statistically speaking, in the middle of the Great Depression. And out of nowhere, the teams started to win. There's an article that I actually put in my first book that a writer actually investigates this. He actually asked the question, upon what meat does our city feed that it has grown so great? With regards to the rise of these sports teams, what made these teams all win in the same year? And what he credited to in his article was the idea that these fans needed something to get excited about. So once these teams even started to play remotely well, the fans turned up in absolute droves. All these teams were setting records for attendance, records that they'd never seen. So if you're an athlete on the field, if you've ever played a sport, there's a whole different vibe. If you go out into the field and fans boo you because you like struck out, for instance, or if the fans say, go out there and do it, kid. We're with you. We're there with you. That's the vibe that they had at that time was you go out there, we are with you. And these fans were just die hard, win or lose. They were with these teams, and these teams fed off of it. And they acknowledged it. So they tapped into that fan enthusiasm, that fan, desire, and it changed everything. Because Detroit in a single year, before 1935, Detroit was a baseball town that had never won a World Series. After 1935, Detroit is one of the great sports towns in the country. In a single year, Detroit sports was born. This is not just an insignificant, kind of like, did you know, factoid trivia question that you put out, lay on somebody at a bar. This is an integral importance with regards to the story of Detroit and how we got here.
Oh, yeah.
Now, the date officially is April 18th.
The celebration,
the official date. Why is this the official date? There's so many people that won, teams that won. Why April 18th?
So there was a proclamation back in 1936. They had a big dinner, and it was the day that it fell on, right?
It was the greatest sports celebration of all time.
Yep.
At the Masonic Temple in Detroit on April 18th, it was called the greatest gathering of champions under a single roof. Here's the thing. There wasn't just the three major sports championships. Joe Louis was the guest of honor at the event. All three teams were all there. The Detroit Times issued a special commemorative newspaper for the event. And in addition to the three major teams, you had a total of 33 championships. Virtually every sport that one can think of, from speedboat racing with Garwood to sprinting with Eddie Tolan, all the way down to the 1935 World Checkers champion, were all from Detroit. They were all there at this dinner. This is the greatest celebration. It took place on April 18th, 1936, and we've been celebrating it in a variety of fashions for over a decade.
I have this feeling that if you had access to a time machine, I know exactly where you're going.
Oh,
ancient Rome.
Yeah.
No, I think you're stopping through this event. I think you want a table at that celebration.
There'll be a
little side.
I'd stop by there.
Yeah,
Not wrong.
yeah.
I'd check that party out if I had a chance. You want to hear something awesome? As I mentioned, there's a commemorative newspaper issued for the event, specifically for the event, by the Detroit Times. They only made 1,000 copies of this newspaper. It wasn't available for sale. It was for a long time, that was my holy grail. And out of nowhere, I got a call from a gentleman who found this newspaper in his attic, and I had this newspaper, and he gave me this newspaper because he knew that in my hands, in my books, bring it out to a podcast and such, that this one newspaper would be able to speak again. Instead of just the 1,000 people at this party, instead of just in his attic.
But what was the cool thing about it?
But this is what I'm getting to. I'm getting to that point, Jamie. At the top of the newspaper was signed by the three top Tiger pitchers from that year. So these guys,
guy was at the party,
yes,
and they got autographs.
They signed it. This newspaper is from their first sit Champions Day dinner at the Masonic Temple, and it was signed by Eldon Auker, Schoolboy Rowe, and Tommy Bridges. Like any three of those autographs for an autograph hound be like, man, that thing is worth a crazy amount. But the fact that it was signed on Champions Day, to me, it's priceless. I would never sell it. Yeah. But it's just the fact that this guy's grandfather, who had found this newspaper, had the presence of mind at that moment to go, I'm getting this newspaper signed by these three guys, is from that dinner.
That's so very kind. One of my side hobbies is to kind of go through, whether it's antique shops or fairs or whatever, and I dig through tables. And one of the things is that sometimes I find stuff where I know it belongs somewhere else and it belongs with a person. And so much of history either belongs with that or with the historical museum, but sometimes it's just a little knicknack or it's a glass or it's something where it's like, oh, I know where you belong for the person who is, it may be $20, but for the person that absolutely loves it. So the event itself is not on that Tuesday. It is on the weekend before. So let's talk about this event because there is a lot going on.
Right. We actually, 2 years ago, Champions Day fell on the weekend, and we did the podcast live from the Detroit Historical Museum, and pandemic, yada, yada, yada. And now this year, they want to do it on the weekend, just have more people coming in. So on the 16th of April, coming up this year, we're going to be at the Detroit Historical Museum from 2 to 3. We're going to do a little formal talk and then a Q&A. The Historical Museum is going to have a bunch of the books that they're going to give away, some of the whole trilogies that they're going to give away.
They got the plaque on display.
And then there'll be a lot of artifacts. So they're going to bring a bunch of the artifacts into the auditorium with us as we do a talk from 2 to 3. But the museum is going to be open all day Sunday, the 16th of April, and we'll be there, and there'll be some refreshments. I'm not sure exactly what.
We've done a lot of.
It'll be fun.
That Detroit Historical Museum has partnered with us for many years. A few years ago, they had a replica bar set up from I forgot which bar.
They
was
did
it
in the downstairs.
The downstairs is absolutely awesome.
They had a historical bar. They had the 1935 banner from the actual 35 Tiger pennant banner, the original down there on the laid out. Like they had the Eastern Market Brewing Company there who created a special Champions Day IPA, giving away free pints of beer. So the Historical Museum's always been fantastic. It's always a fun event. We talk, doing a presentation, which is basically it's just me standing up there. We're going to talk about the City of Champions thing, and we have conversations about it. We talk about it. We try to let people know that there's this incredible story that I like to say has passed to us through a whisper, and we're trying to shout it again.
But they're going to bring out extra artifacts and things that you won't normally see. So coming out on the 16th to the Historical Museum, you're going to see some sports stuff that you don't normally see.
That's awesome, because this seems like the kind of event that is the perfect intersection of whether you are a Tigers fan, a fan of Detroit history, or both. This sounds like the kind of thing that you need to be at.
Yeah.
Now, is there any cost for this? How does this all work?
The Historical Museum is free.
No,
it's
free,
on donation. They like donations, but it's free.
Well, it's always good to support the Historical Museum. And they're one of the all museums need it. But I think, they provide such a service with so many different kinds of programming and different displays and things. They also, and we were talking before we were on the air here, have a piece that is very related to City of Champions history.
They got the piece.
The piece. And can you tell me a little bit about this story, the thumbnail of this story? Because you can actually go see this thing.
It's astounding because it has a signature of President Roosevelt and all 48 governors at the time, which was lost.
So what it is, there's nothing that stands as emblematic or as much of a symbol of this entire story, of this entire City of Champions story, than does the City of Champions plaque. So what it is it's about 5 foot tall, and you can see it on my website and this and that. And I believe it's even on the City of Champions.
What is your website?
Page. DetroitCityOfChampions.com. I have a whole memorabilia museum on the website. But anyways, what it is shortly after the season was over, nobody knows who spent the money to get it made, but somebody commissioned a company in Grand Rapids to make this 5 foot tall mahogany plaque. And the plaque has this beautiful inscription at the top saying, "A nation appreciative of those qualities of sporting achievement recognizes Detroit as the City of Champions." So what they did was, while they were carving this plaque with all these ornate sport figures around it, what they did was they sent out these small little wooden tabs across the country to every governor in the country and to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. All were signed by every governor in the country, and the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, sent back to the company in Grand Rapids affixed to the plaque. And then that plaque was sent up to the Traverse City Cherry Festival to be presented with all the dignitaries from all the teams. All these political dignitaries in Detroit were all there. And so this plaque, nobody knows from that point of the story, from when it was presented at the Traverse City Cherry Festival. Fast forward to 1982. In 1982, the plaque resurfaced at a flea market in Armada. There's a gentleman named Bill Aitken who was wandering through this flea market. There was a heavy dew on the ground from overnight. And as these vendors were taking the tarps off the tables, that plaque was there. And he saw this thing, was like, "What is this?"
How much did you buy it for?
The price tag was so wet from the dew in the middle of the night, he could not even tell how much it cost. And the lady said she was just trying to get rid of it. Her husband had found it. Her husband was demolishing a school and had seen this plaque, removed it from the wall. And
looks cool. I'm going to take it. Right?
Yes, and it had been in their garage for many years, according to this lady. And so she just wanted rid of it. So she sold it to Bill Aitken for $30. And so Bill Aitken then had it restored. And then he donated it to the Detroit Historical Museum, where it sat almost like an Indiana Jones in a
cart in the basement,
like in a box in their archives.
All these museums have extra things that you don't see on all the time, right?
And this was one of them. And so at one point, I was talking to Tracy Irwin at the Detroit Historical Museum. I was doing an event for the museum, talking about City of Champions, this and that. She brought it out and put it on a table, and she said, "Have you seen this?
Is this important?"
And I was like, "I've never seen this before, right?"
And but so before that, they didn't have it on display. They never
wasn't
really
even on display.
It's a thing. It's sports. We'll put it in the basement.
Yeah, but nothing stands as a testament to the City of Champions story in its not only in its glory, but also in its disappearance, like the plaque itself. because, like I say, in its glory, it's like up at the Traverse City Cherry Festival. It's like staging with photos with some of the greatest stars of its era. And then nobody knows what happened to it for 50, 80 years. And then it resurfaces. And now it's, it's on display at the Historical Museum. But many people look at it and have no idea what it even is.
Well, and there was so much tumult, not just at the time, but right after. You go into World War II.
100%.
Then you go into the Flight of the 50.
Right.
Like
100%.
all kinds of things that were happening.
Yeah.
Now, real quick, before I let you go, I want to ask each of you, who or what is your favorite champion? And it can be one of the mainstream ones or something completely absurd. Tell me about someone that nobody's ever heard of. What are some of your favorites?
Oh, it's not one of the athletes or one of the teams. It's the reporter, Iffy the Dulpster.
Yeah, Jamie loves it.
I just love
it. Oh, yeah, that's a legendary name.
But here's the thing, and Charles's books are wholly based on the primary resources of these news articles from the day. And the thing he quoted earlier, it's upon which meat do we feed, just the rich language and the writing of the journalists of the day. And I get so immersed in that, and I love that. I kind of amalgamate them all into Iffy the Dulpster. But I love the journalists of the day and how they covered the rich. And, today wouldn't be considered journalistic writing. I think it's gorgeous and I love it. And Charles has so much of it captured in his books, and we go through a lot of it on the podcast. And so that's so much from a journalism standpoint. I love that. But who's your guy? You got two. You got your favorite story. You got your favorite person.
It's an impossible
You got
question.
your favorite person, your favorite story.
It's an impossible question for me to answer with a single
it
player.
is.
It's an impossible question for me to answer in a single player. So I'll just rip right through a quick thing, okay? So my favorite athlete of all time is Joe Louis, of all time. And I learned that specifically from the City of Champions season. My favorite story from the City of Champions season was Garwood, the speedboat racer. My favorite Tiger was Mickey Cochran. He's my favorite Tiger of all time. My favorite Detroit Lions player. Everybody loves Dutch Clark. It's tough to say he's not your favorite because he's just such a superstar. He's such a legend. But my favorite Lion that's not Dutch Clark is Glenn Presnell. My favorite Red Wing is Ebby Goodfellow. But my favorite Red Wing from 1935, tell me who my favorite.
The bent ankles.
Yes. Bucko McDonald.
Bucko.
So,
I love Bucko.
That's what I'm saying. So my favorite Red Wing from the story was Ebby Goodfellow, but my favorite 1935 specific Red Wing was Bucko McDonald.
Bucko. So he's
I had to break it up. There's
character.
no other way. I had to break. I couldn't to not mention all of those names would be to do an injustice.
And as
for
we
all.
wander through the City of Champions podcast and the stories, we focus on each of these guys and just their eccentricities and just how fun they were and the things that they brought to the city and how they got engaged in the city. It's just a ton of fun. And then it's brought to life through the writing of these amazing journalists and the dynamic writing of the day.
Well, I love that old style of writing.
Yes.
It's something that you don't see as much nowadays, but it was part of the capturing of attention that newspapers did, because this is definitely the era before TikTok, right?
And they did.
It was the era before TV.
And it's before TV, so their goal was to capture the excitement of the events in print. And in order to do that, it wasn't the Detroit Red Wings scored their second goal in the first period. No, it was the Red Wolves on the prowl. It was the whirling red dervishes spun their way for their third goal of the game. It was a totally different writing style.
For sure. And papers were selling against each other right on the street corner.
And battling
you
it out.
mentioned the Detroit Times. People forget about that. The Detroit Times building was right behind the book tower of today. And the book tower was there then, of course. But it's kind of where the buses do the turnaround now.
Yeah.
And the Detroit Times was the paper that was known as the best at selling at the newsstand, right? Yeah. They always had the most flourishing headlines.
My favorite newspaper ever. It's my favorite newspaper.
Extra.
Yeah.
Well, it's one of the reasons we have a shield in our logo. It's somewhat inspired by that.
Is it good?
Good.
I'm glad to hear that,
went to the Historical Museum and I saw the Detroit Times thing. I'm like, okay,
but
that
the
is
Detroit
inspiration.
Times, the Detroit Times in its day, it was a William Randolph Hearst newspaper.
Yeah.
Everybody hated Hearst. Everybody hated these guys because they had their own wire service. They all operated on sort of interior newspaper route networks, so they could all share their information.
They
with
also
each other.
sometimes had a horse in the newsroom.
Yeah, but what they did was
that's my kind of team, right? I want a horse in the studio.
But they were the kind of newspaper that sought to basically embarrass their competitors and say, we're the best. These guys are they're second best. They were competitive at it, right? One of my favorite stories with the Detroit Times was that there was, I think it was 1927, but the Detroit News inside the actual building, their cashier's desk had been held up at gunpoint. Somebody robbed the cashier's stand, right? And so what ended up happening, the Detroit Times published an extra edition that day going, extra, Detroit News Building held up. So they beat the Detroit News to their own headline, right? So and they rubbed it in their face like only the Detroit Times brings you the news story before they do, you know?
Well, you know, Detroit is the best sports town in America, and I still believe it's one of, if not the best media town in America, too.
Sure, I agree with you.
You know, there's so much great talent here. All right, James Flanagan, Charles Avison, the Detroit City of Champions podcast, as well as the book, as well as the event, April 16th. Where can people go to sign up or know more?
Just the Detroit Historical Museum website.
Awesome.
If you actually want to celebrate on the 18th, we wouldn't turn down a drink or an offer if one is.
I don't feel like you would.
We wouldn't be put out if a drink is not offered to us that day either. So we'll be out doing something like a little more social that day as well.
So just Detroit City of Champions on all social media and YouTube, Facebook.
DetroitCityOfChampions.com. Yep, the museum on the 16th. 12 Oaks Mall, Partridge Creek. There's a Michigan art store there called Inspire Marketplace. You find me there very often. We talk sports while history.
He will talk to you for an hour.
There is no doubt, and I know that there are hours on the podcast that people can listen to. In case you didn't know, this was a home and home. So there is a different conversation on the Detroit City of Champions podcast where we went ahead and talked about the Daily Detroit crest and talked about their interesting crest, very cool crest that celebrates that 1935 season. It is in their podcast feed. Thank you so much for listening to Your Daily Detroit. Also, thank you so much to our members on Patreon, patreon.com/dailydetroit. Thank you to our team behind the scenes. I hope that you have an absolutely wonderful weekend. I will see some of you out at Keyworth on Saturday, and if I don't see you there, I will see you on Monday for a fresh episode of Your Daily Detroit. With that, I am Jared Stays. Thank you so much for listening. Remember that you are somebody, and we'll see you around town.